Today we're going to talk about ordering decimals and fractions to the thousandths. Okay, so if you were given these three fractions, it's easy to tell which fraction is the greatest because they all have a common denominator of 5. So if my pie is cut into 5 equal pieces and I've got 1 piece or 3 pieces or 2 pieces of those 5, I know right away 3 pieces of those 5 would be the greatest. However, when you're given fractions that have different denominators, that's when it gets a little more difficult to tell which fraction is the least and which fraction is the greatest. What could I do so that I can compare them? Well, I've got tenths and I've got fifths. It would be fairly easy to make fifths tenths, to use what I know about making equivalent fractions by multiplying the denominator and the numerator by the same thing. Okay? So I'm multiplying my denominator by 2. So I do the exact same thing in the numerator, multiply my numerator by 2, and 4 times 2 is 8. So 8 tenths is equivalent to 4 fifths. Now that I have all 3 fractions in tenths, I have 7 tenths, 8 tenths, and 3 tenths. It's much easier to compare and to figure out which fraction would be the smallest fraction and which fraction would be the greatest fraction. Well, 7 tenths, 8 tenths, or 3 tenths? Which one is the least? 3 tenths. Which one would be the next biggest? 7 tenths. And which one would be the greatest? 8 tenths. But that's actually 4 fifths. So I'm going to use the original fraction when I'm ordering. Okay, I've converted it to its equivalent form, an equivalent fraction, in order to be able to compare it. But when I write my final answer, I put it back to its original 4 fifths form. Okay? So let's try these. I have 6 tenths, 53 hundredths, and 4 tenths. Well, the easiest thing is going to be to make them all have denominators of 100, right? So what if I had to multiply my denominator by to equal 100? 10 times 10 is 100, right? So then I do the same thing in the numerator. 6 times 10, 60. 53 hundredths is already hundredths, so I don't have to change anything. 4 tenths, I can convert that to an equivalent fraction, hundredths, by multiplying again by 10 in the denominator, so I multiply by 10 in the numerator. 4 times 10 is 40. Okay, so now I can look easily and compare these fractions because they all have a common denominator of 100. So 60 hundredths, 53 hundredths, 40 hundredths. Which one is the least? 40 hundredths, but again, when I list it, I want to go back to its original 4 tenths form. Okay? Okay, so I've done this one. Which one is the next greatest? 53 hundredths, but I go back to its original, which in this case just happens to be the same. We didn't have to change that one. And which one is the greatest fraction? 60 hundredths, which if I go to its original form, that was 6 tenths. So I've done that. Okay, let's try another one. The exact same way. I have 37 hundredths, I have 405 thousandths, and I have 42 thousandths. Well, I'm going to convert them all to thousandths by using equivalent fractions. So what if I had to multiply my denominator by? 100 times what gives me 1,000? Multiplying by 10. So if I've done that in the denominator, I do the same thing in the numerator. 37 times 10 is 370 thousandths. Then I have 405 thousandths, and I have 42 thousandths. Those don't need to be changed because they already have denominators of thousandths. But now it's easier for me to compare and see which one is the smallest and which one is the greatest. Well, the least is obviously 42 thousandths. I'm going to use the original form of that. 42 thousandths is less than The next biggest would be 370 thousandths, which the original form was 37 hundredths. So I've used that one. And the greatest fraction is 405 thousandths. I can write that in its original form. It did not change. Okay, I'd like you to try C and D on your paper, and you're going to be handing this in at the end of watching this video. So stop the video for a minute, give these two questions a try, doing it the exact same way as the examples I just showed you, and then restart the video when you're ready. Okay, let's look now at some decimals. 0.5, 0.36, and 0.52. How could we compare these decimals? Well, it's a little different than just whole numbers, because when I look at this, 0.5 looks less than 0.36 and 0.52. In fact, it already looks like they're in order from least to greatest. But decimals, I have to remember, are a fractional part of a whole number. They're not a whole number, and so they're a little different. So let's use what we know about decimals and fractions to rewrite 0.5 in its fraction form. This 5 is in the first position after the decimal. That's the tenths place. So this is 5/10. 0.36, well, that number, 36, ends in the second place after the decimal. That's the hundredths. So this is 36 hundredths. And 0.52 then would be 52 hundredths. Now that they're in fractions, I can compare them a little easier, except they're not in fractions with the same denominator. I've got tenths and I've got hundredths. So I'm just going to take this first one, 5/10, one step further, and use what I know about equivalent fractions to convert it to a fraction with 100 in the denominator. What have I multiplied by? 10 times 10 is 100. So I do the same in the top, multiply by 10. 5 times 10 is 50. Okay, now I can compare, because I have 50 hundredths, I have 36 hundredths, I have 52 hundredths. Okay, which one is the least? Well, 36 hundredths. So when I rewrite this as my final answer, I'm going to go back to the original form, though, which was the decimal form, 36 hundredths. Okay, so I've done that. Which is the next biggest? 50 hundredths or 52 hundredths? 50 hundredths is the next biggest. But again, for my final answer, I go back to its original form, which was 0.5. I've used that one. Now the largest one is 52 hundredths, and I'm going to write it in its decimal form, 0.52. So when I look at my final answer, I can't tell just by looking at those decimals which one is the smallest number and which one is the greatest number. I had to rewrite them as fractions with common denominators in order to be able to tell. They're not just the way they look. Okay, we're going to use that same procedure then with a few other sets of decimals. We're going to do the first two together, and then you're going to have some you're going to work on your own. Okay, so 0.75. Rewritten as a fraction would be 75 hundredths. 0.8 would be 8 tenths. And 0.63 would be 63 hundredths. Okay, well, right away I see a problem. I've got 8 tenths. I need to make it hundredths. If I multiply by 10 in the denominator, I multiply by 10 in the numerator. Okay, so that's 80 hundredths. Now I can compare them. 75 hundredths, 80 hundredths, and 63 hundredths. Which one is the smallest number there? 63 hundredths, which is 0.63, going back to the original form. So I've used that one. The next biggest would be 75 hundredths, which is 0.75. And the largest number there is 80 hundredths, which in back to the original was 0.8 tenths. All right, let's try B. 0.504 would be 504, ending in the third position after the decimal, that's the thousandths. 0.49, that's 49, ending in the second position after the decimal, hundredths. And 0.6, ending in the first position after the decimal, that's 6 tenths. Oh, I've got all different denominators. I'm going to have to make them all the same before I can compare them. Well, I'm going to make them all thousandths. So this one already is. This one, 49 hundredths. Whoop. If I want to make it thousandths, what have I multiplied my denominator by? 10. So I multiply my numerator by 10, 490 thousandths. And 6 tenths, if I want to multiply the denominator to make thousandths, I've multiplied by, I've added 2 zeros, that's multiplying by 100. So I have to do the same to my numerator. 6 times 100 is 600. Now I can compare those. I have all thousandths. 504 thousandths, 490 thousandths, 600 thousandths. Okay, which number is the smallest number there? 490 thousandths. Going back to its original form, that was 0.49. Okay, that one's dealt with. Which number is the next biggest? 504 thousandths. So I go back to its original decimal form, 0.504. And the largest number there then would be 600 thousandths, which if I go back to its original decimal form, 0.6. Okay, so you're going to do the same thing again. You're going to pause the video and give these C and D a try, and then restart the video again when you're ready. Okay, we're going to rewrite these fractions as hundreds and then as thousandths using what we know about equivalent fractions in order to see if we see any patterns when we rewrite them as decimals. Okay, so 7 tenths, I can rewrite that as hundredths just by multiplying by 10. So you do the same thing that you did in the denominator in the numerator. Multiply by 10. So 7 times 10 is 70. So 70 hundredths is equivalent to 7 tenths. Okay? I can do that again by multiplying my denominator by 10 to get thousandths, but I have to remember to do the same thing in the numerator. Multiply by 10 to get 700 thousandths. Now let's rewrite each of those fractions as decimals. Okay, so 7 tenths looks like 0.7, which must be equal to 70 hundredths, which we rewrite as 70, ending in the second position after the decimal place, the hundredths position, which is equal to, again, 700 thousandths, which we rewrite as 700, ending in the third position after the decimal. What do you notice about those decimals that are all equivalent to each other? In each case, we've just added zeros onto the end, haven't we? When you add a 0 onto the end of a decimal, you make equivalent decimals. It doesn't change the value of the decimal, it just makes it equivalent decimal. So we can use that fact in order to compare decimals. If we don't want to have to convert them to fractions and then find common denominators, another way to do it is to use what we know about equivalent decimals, adding zeros onto the end of a decimal to make an equivalent decimal. When we do that, we rewrite them to the smallest place value. Well, we have to think about what the smallest place value would be. Okay, because I've got an example here with tenths, hundredths, and thousandths. Which one is the smallest place value? Tenths, hundredths, or thousandths? Well, if we're thinking about a pie split into 10 equal pieces, and I have one of them, or that same pie split into 100 equal pieces, and I have one of them, or that same pie split into 1,000 equal pieces, and I have one of them, which one do I have more? Tenths, right? Tenths are greater than thousandths. So what that means is the position further to the right in decimals are smaller place values, aren't they? So thousandths are way smaller than tenths. It's a little bit different in decimals because the decimal part is the fractional part. It's not a whole number. It's a portion or a piece of a whole. And the more place values that you have going further and further and further to the right, the smaller and smaller and smaller those place values are getting. Okay? So in this case, because I have tenths and hundredths and thousandths, I need to rewrite them all to the smallest place value. That means to the thousandths, by just adding zeros on the end. So if I want to rewrite 4/10ths as thousandths, I just add 2 zeros, 400 thousandths. 56 hundredths, I would rewrite that as 560 thousandths. 392 thousandths is already thousandths, so I'm just going to leave it as it is. Now that I have it like that, it's a little easier to see which one is the smallest. I have 400 thousandths, 560 thousandths, 392 thousandths. Well, 392 thousandths is the least. Which is the next biggest? 400 thousandths or 560 thousandths? Well, 400 thousandths. But I'm going to take the original form, which is 0.4. And then the largest would be 560 thousandths, which is, in its original form, 0.56. Okay, so let's try that for A. 0.54, 0.346, 0.6. Well, we're going to rewrite them all to the smallest place value. I've got hundredths, thousandths, tenths, thousandths. Okay, so 0.54 would be thousandths just by adding 1 zero. 0.346 is already thousandths, and 0.6, I'd need to add 2 zeros to make it thousandths. Now I can compare them. I've got 540 thousandths, 346 thousandths, 600 thousandths. Which one's the smallest? 346. So I'm going to use the original form for my final answer. Okay, which one would be the next biggest? 540 or 600? 540. And I'm going to use the original 0.54. And 0.6, which is 600 thousandths. That's the biggest one. Okay, let's try B. 295 thousandths. That's already thousandths, so I'm just going to leave it. 0.3, well, I can make that thousandths just by adding 2 zeros on the end. And 0.29, I can make that thousandths just by adding 1 decimal on the end. Okay, which one is the smallest number? 295 thousandths, 300 thousandths, or 290 thousandths? 290, right? There's the original. So for my answer, I always go back to the original. Okay, what's the next biggest? 295 thousandths or 300 thousandths? 295 thousandths. And the biggest, the largest number? 300 thousandths, which the original form of that was 0.3. Okay, you're going to do C and D on your own the same way. Pause the video, and then you will hand that assignment in when you're finished today and get the new assignment for today.